Title: The Life of Marilyn Monroe. Chapter 1: The Weight of Shadows. The sunlight in Los Angeles had a way of feeling indifferent, especially when you were waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. For young Norma Jeane, the world was a collection of transient rooms, wallpaper peeling like sunburnt skin, and strangers who moved as shadows against walls that never felt like home. Gladys, her mother, was a flickering light, bright, intense, and prone to sudden, terrifying outages. When the house grew heavy with the silence of her mother's illness, Norma Jeane learned to retreat into the corners, not just as a lonely child, but as an observer. She realized early that if she became small, she might avoid the sharp edges of the world. It was in these early, neglected years that she first understood the power of silence. She began to curate her own inner world, a sanctuary of imagination, where she was neither abandoned nor forgotten, but central to the story. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Escape. Foster homes were a revolving door of rules, chores, and the strange, lingering scent of other people's lives. Norma Jeane's identity became a fragile, fluid thing, constantly reshaped by the expectations of whoever held custody over her. To survive, she developed the observer's gaze, a way of watching how women carried themselves, how they laughed, and how they controlled the attention of others. When reality became too harsh, she retreated to the cinema. The flickering silver screen was her only true parent, teaching her that beauty was a shield. She watched the actresses move through scenes with an effortless, graceful poise, and she began to practice those expressions in the cracked mirrors of bathroom stalls, masking her vulnerability behind a shy, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Chapter 3: The Cage of Comfort. At 16, the walls of the orphanage felt like they were closing in, and the prospect of a normal life, of a kitchen that was hers and a door she could lock, was a siren song. James Dougherty was solid, predictable, and entirely oblivious to the restless, hungry spirit beneath Norma Jeane's quiet exterior. Marriage felt like a logical solution to the chaos of her childhood, a way to anchor herself in the world. Yet, as she stood in their small home while he worked at the aircraft plant, she felt the walls shrink rather than expand. The stability she had craved turned into a new kind of confinement. She was playing the role of a domestic wife, but the script felt foreign, a hollow performance that left her gasping for air. Chapter 4: The Lens of Opportunity. The radio plane company was a landscape of grease, metal, and the drone of wartime necessity. Norma Jeane, her hair tied back in a bandana, moved through the factory floor like a displaced star in a gritty documentary. When David Conover arrived with his camera, he wasn't just capturing a worker, he was capturing a transformation. The click of the shutter became the most important sound of her life, a signal that she was finally being seen. As the flash illuminated her face, she didn't feel like a factory girl anymore. She felt like a subject, a woman of infinite potential. For the first time, she understood that her appearance was not just a burden, it was a currency, a way to buy her own freedom from the life that had been forced upon her. Chapter 5: The Creation of the Icon. Norma Jeane began to fade, replaced by a silhouette that was more light than flesh. She experimented with the alchemy of stardom, the bleaching of her hair to a radiant platinum, the refining of her walk into a deliberate, rhythmic sway, and the softening of her voice into a breathy, intimate invitation. This was not just a makeover, it was the engineering of a deity. Marilyn Monroe was the armor she built to withstand the scrutiny of Hollywood, a persona designed to project absolute confidence and vulnerability simultaneously. She polished this mask until it gleamed, knowing that as long as the world was focused on the icon, they would never look close enough to see the scared, lonely girl from the foster home still hiding in the center of the flame. Chapter 6: The Alchemy of Hollywood. The gates of 20th Century Fox were not just steel and concrete, they were the boundaries of a new, ruthless religion. Norma Jeane, now Marilyn, stepped onto the lot as a contract player, a face among thousands, often relegated to the background, a mere atmospheric detail in someone else's epic. She was subjected to the cold, analytical gaze of producers who saw her not as a person, but as a project to be refined, edited, and marketed. Yet, in the quiet moments between takes, she was a sponge. She watched the veterans, studying the way they shifted their weight, or held a gaze to command the lens. She understood that Hollywood was a performance that never truly ended, and she began to craft her behavior off-camera as carefully as she did on. She was learning to survive by becoming the version of herself that they wanted to see, even as she felt the original girl drifting further away. Chapter 7: The Breakthrough. The turning point was not a grand gesture, but a series of precise, haunting performances. In the asphalt jungle and All About Eve, she was no longer just a platinum prop, she was a presence. Critics found themselves pausing, caught off guard by the depth of longing and the subtle, jagged edges of pain she managed to convey behind the bombshell mask. She realized then that her secret weapon was her transparency. While others hid behind rigid personas, she brought the ghost of Norma Jeane into the light. She allowed the audience to see a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the porcelain surface, and that vulnerability was what made them fall in love with her. She wasn't just acting, she was offering them a piece of the isolation she had known all her life, and they were captivated. Chapter 8: The Gilded Cage. As her fame ballooned, the studio recognized the power of the blonde bombshell archetype and clamped down with suffocating force. They controlled her wardrobe, her hair, her schedule, and even her public personality. Marilyn felt the irony keenly. She had used the image to build her independence, only to find it had become a prison of her own making. She was treated like a precious commodity, but never like a partner. The public wanted the laugh, the walk, and the breathy voice, and they resented it when she dared to show anything else. She began to feel like a silhouette walking through a world that was painted in bright, shallow colors, constantly forced to repeat the same performance for an audience that had no interest in the woman behind the platinum hair. Chapter 9: The Gentlemen Prefer Blondes Era. With the premiere of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was everywhere, on every magazine cover, in every conversation, a global phenomenon defined by the iconic pink dress and the song about diamonds. It was a masterclass in charm, a performance so seamless that it felt effortless, even though she was meticulously calculating every gesture. Yet, this peak of public adoration felt oddly lonely. She was the most famous woman on the planet, a symbol of luxury and desire, but the success only highlighted the distance between the icon and the individual. The more the world celebrated Marilyn Monroe, the more Norma Jeane felt like a ghost, a phantom presence watching her own life unfold from a great, insurmountable distance. Chapter 10: The 7-Year Itch. The subway grate scene became the defining image of her career, a moment of pure, cinematic magic captured in a whirlwind of white fabric and flashbulbs. While the world saw an icon, Marilyn saw a nightmare of exposure, a spectacle that fueled a fire of public obsession and private torment. The relentless, invasive attention took a direct toll on her personal life, turning her relationships into battlegrounds. She felt like a lightning rod, drawing the expectations and projections of a million strangers. The scene was intended to be a light-hearted comedic beat, but it became the catalyst for a new level of scrutiny she could not escape. Every time she stepped out her door, she was expected to be that woman on the grate, happy, effortless, and eternally available, a standard that was becoming impossible for her to sustain. Chapter 11: The Marriage to Joe DiMaggio. The union of Marilyn and the Yankee Clipper felt, to the public, like the final piece of the American puzzle, the marriage of the silver screen queen and the diamond hero. But beneath the flash of the press cameras, the reality was a quiet, suffocating conflict. Joe was a man who wanted a traditional wife, someone who would dim her own light to stay safely within the shadows of his legacy. Marilyn, however, was already a hurricane of ambition and identity that could not be reined in. Every public appearance that drew the adoring gaze of millions felt like a betrayal to her husband, creating a chasm of misunderstanding. The marriage collapsed under the weight of these clashing worlds, A volatile episode that left her bruised by the realization that even the greatest stars could be profoundly misunderstood by the people who claimed to love them. Chapter 12. Seeking Serious Acting. The lights of Hollywood had begun to feel like heat lamps, drying out her soul. In 1955, she made a radical break, moving to New York City to enroll at the Actors Studio under the guidance of Lee Strasberg. In the dim, dusty rooms of the studio, she was finally permitted to shed the bombshell persona that had become a gilded cage. Here, she wasn't the image on the subway grate, she was an apprentice, a student searching for the raw nerves of truth. She found a strange, desperate peace in the discipline of the craft, surrounded by intellectuals and artists who valued her mind more than her silhouette. It was an attempt to reclaim the woman she had been before the world decided who she was supposed to be. Chapter 13. Marriage to Arthur Miller. When she married Arthur Miller in 1956, the press called it the collision of the brain and the body, the playwright and the icon. To Marilyn, however, Miller was a bridge to a world of intellectual depth and emotional legitimacy that she had never been granted before. She hungered for his approval, viewing him as a mentor who could finally validate her existence. The relationship was fraught with a complex, exhausting intimacy. Miller wrote for her, and she lived for him, but the marriage eventually crumbled under the mounting pressures of her declining mental health and the impossibility of existing as both a superstar and a private muse. It was a union of immense passion and equally immense frustration, a failed attempt to build a permanent home in a world that only ever wanted to rent her image. Chapter 14. The Prince and the Showgirl. The filming of The Prince and the Showgirl in London became an exercise in cultural and professional warfare. Working under Laurence Olivier, a titan of traditional theatre, Marilyn felt a constant, biting disapproval. Olivier viewed her method acting as undisciplined and erratic, while Marilyn viewed his direction as cold, dismissive, and lacking the empathy she required to reach her potential. She struggled through the production, often feeling isolated in a foreign country and unsupported by the man in the director's chair. Despite the toxicity on set, she delivered a performance that remains a sharp, intelligent testament to her perseverance. It was a reminder that even when she felt abandoned by her collaborators, she possessed a stubborn, internal drive to honor her craft. Chapter 15. Some Like It Hot. Some Like It Hot was not just a film, it was the pinnacle of her comedic genius, an intricate dance of timing and pathos that remains untouched. On set, she was often paralyzed by anxiety, struggling to remember lines or to arrive on time, a fact that wore down the patience of those around her. Yet, when the camera rolled, the confusion vanished. She transformed her personal struggle into a performance of incredible empathy and vulnerability, proving she could hold the screen against anyone. It was perhaps the clearest moment where her inner softness became her professional strength. The film's success solidified her as an untouchable icon, though she felt the exhaustion of the role deeper than anyone else ever would. Chapter 16. The Pressure of Celebrity. By the late 1950s, the name Marilyn was no longer just a woman, it was a weight that pulled at the earth beneath her feet. Every time she stepped out her front door, the air itself seemed to change, thickening with the flash of bulbs and the hungry stares of a public that felt they owned every inch of her existence. She lived in a constant, high-definition state of performance, where the boundary between the private Norma Jeane and the public icon had completely eroded. The exhaustion was physical, a marrow-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could remedy. She would spend hours staring at the mirror, trying to find the girl she once was, but seeing only the mask that the world demanded. To be Marilyn was to be a mirror that everyone else looked into to see their own desires reflected. She was expected to be eternally joyful, perpetually seductive, and indefinitely available, a standard of perfection that felt like a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose around her own identity. Chapter 17. Inner Turmoil. Behind the carefully orchestrated smiles that made the covers of magazines, Marilyn was a woman living in a storm. The silence of her own home was the most dangerous time, a void where the memories of foster homes and the stinging rejections of her past would creep back to haunt her. Chronic insomnia became her most intimate companion, dragging her through nights that stretched toward infinity, until the only escape from her own racing thoughts was the numbing release of prescription medication. She began a desperate, cycle-driven search for doctors who could provide not just medicine, but validation, someone who could see past the blonde hair and the breathy voice to the woman who was drowning. Her life had become a series of jagged highs and terrifying lows, a roller coaster existence where the heights of fame only served to make the inevitable crashes more devastating. She was, in every sense, a prisoner to the very celebrity that was supposed to have set her free. Chapter 18: The Misfits. The Nevada desert was a landscape of blistering heat and indifferent vastness, the perfect stage for the slow-motion collapse of her marriage to Arthur Miller. The Misfits was designed to be her triumph, a gift written by her husband to prove her worth as a serious dramatic actress, but it became a grueling, sun-baked endurance test. She felt the eyes of the cast and crew upon her, waiting for the Marilyn of the movies to arrive, while the real woman inside was barely holding herself together. Each day on the set was a negotiation between her physical frailty and the demands of the scene. When she stood before the camera, she didn't just act, she bled. She delivered a performance that was raw, unvarnished, and perhaps the most honest thing she ever gave to the world, but it cost her every reserve of energy she had. As the desert dust settled at the end of each day, she felt more like a ruin than a star, realizing that the film was documenting the death of her marriage in real time. Chapter 19: The End of the Miller Marriage. The finalization of her divorce from Arthur Miller in 1961 felt like the last anchor being cut from a drifting ship. Miller had been her last real connection to the world of intellect and legitimacy, the man she had hoped would save her from the superficiality of her Hollywood existence. Without him, she felt adrift in a sea of her own making, stripped of the status that marriage had provided. Her professional life began to fracture as well, mirroring the instability of her private world. She would sign on to projects, desperate to prove her relevance, only to find the anxiety too great to sustain. She was an icon in search of a future, but the industry that had built her up was beginning to look at her as a liability. The tragedy was that she was finally finding the courage to be herself, but the world had no interest in the real Marilyn, they only wanted the ghost of the girl they had imagined. Chapter 20: Personal Setbacks. The spiral downward was quiet, lonely, and punctuated by the sterile walls of hospital rooms. After the collapse of her marriage, she faced a series of medical issues that forced her into a seclusion she had once fought to avoid. Then came the catastrophic failure of Something's Got to Give. She was fired from her final project, labeled a disappointment, by the very executives who had once begged for her time. The headlines turned cruel, and the rumors began to carry the weight of fact. For a woman who had been the focal point of the world's attention for a decade, this sudden, cold indifference was a different kind of pain. She retreated into her Brentwood home, surrounded by walls that held the echoes of a life she no longer recognized. The woman who had once defined the dreams of a generation now sat in the quiet, grappling with the crushing reality of being forgotten while she was still alive. Chapter 21: The Final Months. The early months of 1962 were a paradox of desperate movement and paralyzed stillness. Marilyn was caught in a frantic, exhausting loop. She would commit to a comeback, attend a high-profile event like the birthday tribute for President Kennedy, and then retreat into a state of total physical and emotional exhaustion. The public performance of Marilyn had become so demanding that it left nothing behind for the human vessel that had to sustain it. The studio executives, once fawning, were now cold and transactional, viewing her as an investment that had soured. Every meeting, every phone call, and every request for a scene was a negotiation with forces that did not care about her well-being. She felt the walls closing in, the professional pressure combining with a deep, internal sense that she was losing the ability to distinguish between her own desires and the demands placed upon her by a world that refused to let her grow old, change, or simply rest. Chapter 22, The Kennedy Connection. The air around her final year was thick with rumors, whispers that trailed her like smoke. The associations with high-ranking political figures, most notably the Kennedys, brought with them a level of scrutiny that was both intoxicating and terrifying. It was a world of immense power, secrecy, and high stakes, a stark departure from the lights of the film set, yet equally performance-based. She found herself in an orbit where she was never quite sure who was a friend and who was a spectator. The political intrigue added a jagged layer of anxiety to her life. She was no longer just a movie star, she was a figure of curiosity in a broader, more dangerous game. It was an environment that amplified her existing isolation, as the reality of these connections remained forever shielded from the public, leaving her to navigate the complex emotions of these ties entirely on her own. Chapter 23, The Last Interview. The final interviews, such as the one conducted for Life magazine, were different. They were the sound of a woman who had finally stopped trying to keep the mask perfectly still. In these conversations, she was reflective, weary, and startlingly candid. She spoke not as the platinum icon, but as a person who had spent her life trying to survive the machinery of fame. There was a poignant quality to these words, as if she were finally inviting the world to see the girl from the orphanage, the girl who had always just wanted to be safe. She expressed a fatigue with the Marilyn persona, a desire for genuine connection, and a strange, quiet acknowledgement of the distance she had traveled. It was as if, in the waning light of her life, she was trying to reclaim her own narrative, offering the public a glimpse of the real woman before the image finally and completely took over. Chapter 24, The Final Day. August 4th, 1962, arrived with the quiet, stifling heat of a Los Angeles summer. It was a day of profound solitude in the Brentwood home that she had chosen to be her sanctuary, a place where she had hoped to finally find peace. There were no cameras, no directors shouting orders, and no fans waiting for a smile. In the stillness of that house, the long, arduous journey of Norma Jeane Mortensen reached its conclusion. It was the end of a struggle that had spanned decades, the final chapter for a woman who had been loved by millions yet had often felt, in the deepest parts of herself, entirely abandoned. The silence of that bedroom marked the end of the performance, leaving behind only the mystery of a life that had shone with the intensity of 1,000 suns, only to fade into the quiet, heavy dark. Chapter 25, A Lasting Legacy. Marilyn Monroe remains fixed in the firmament of history, an image that has survived the woman who created it. Yet, the true legacy of her life is not merely the photographs or the films, it is the complex, often painful story of a woman who navigated the most oppressive systems of her time. She fought for her identity, struggled against the narrow definitions imposed upon her, and carried the weight of a world that wanted her to be everything except herself. Her story remains a permanent fixture of our culture, a dazzling, glittering portrait of the heights of Hollywood stardom, and a haunting, necessary cautionary tale. She reminds us of the immense human cost of being an icon, and the quiet, enduring power of the person who exists beneath the spotlight. In the end, the woman we call Marilyn Monroe was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, a life that was both a triumph and a tragedy, forever preserved in the memory of the world.